right now, as the earth turns its heavy, quiet face away from the warmth of the sun, and the shadows stretch long and cool across the walls of the room you are resting in, there is a sprawling, continuous rhythm echoing across the globe. There are more than 8 billion human beings breathing, dreaming, and simply existing on this spinning rock. 8 billion hearts beating in the dark, driving a warm, crimson tide through millions of miles of hidden vessels. And yet, across that unfathomable, staggering ocean of humanity, scattered randomly across distant continents and completely hidden within the ordinary, mundane rhythm of daily life, there are fewer than 50 individuals who carry a profound, silent secret running through their veins. Out of 8 billion lives, less than 50 possess a biological anomaly so exquisitely rare, so mathematically improbable, that it defies the very foundations of established medical science. They carry within them what is quietly, reverently known in the sterile, brightly lit halls of global hematology wards as Rh-Null, the golden blood. What if I told you that everything you learned about the simple, neat categories of human blood, the familiar letters, the A's, the B's, the O's, the straightforward positives and negatives, was merely a surface illusion, a comforting, simplistic map drawn over a deeply complex and largely uncharted territory of microscopic architecture? If you are using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is for. So get comfortable, maybe subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Whether the late evening winds are currently sweeping across the concrete grid of Chicago, or the first pale hints of early morning mist are just beginning to settle over the quiet, cobblestone streets of Prague and Edinburgh. As the night deepens and the immediate world around you slows down to a gentle halt, consider for a moment the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the human population. If you were to stand on a high vantage point overlooking a sprawling metropolis at midnight, watching the endless streams of headlights blurring into rivers of amber and red, you would be looking at only a microscopic fraction of the human species. We are a vast, interconnected network of biological machines, moving constantly, consuming, building, and sleeping. And within every single one of those bodies, an identical, ancient process is quietly unfolding. Blood is not merely a fluid. It is a highly complex, liquid, connective tissue. It is a densely populated, rushing ecosystem that is older than our conscious thought. Every single second, in the absolute, lightless darkness of your bone marrow, your body is manufacturing more than 2 million red blood cells. These microscopic, biconcave discs are born in the quiet hollows of your ribs, your spine, and your pelvis, immediately thrust into a high-speed journey through the winding, branching rivers of your circulatory system. They drift through the wide, roaring avenues of the aorta, and they squeeze, single file, through the incredibly narrow, microscopic corridors of the capillaries in your fingertips and your eyelids. They are the silent couriers of life, binding oxygen from the air you just breathed in and carrying it to the furthest, darkest outposts of your physical form. They do this without your permission, without your awareness, and without any conscious effort. It is an automated, ancient machinery that has kept our ancestors walking across ice ages and deserts for hundreds of thousands of years. For centuries, human beings looked at this crimson fluid and saw only a uniform, mystical substance. We believed it was the absolute, singular essence of life, identical in every person who walked the earth. We bled the same color, we bruised in the same hues of purple and blue, and therefore we assumed the microscopic landscape was uniform. We liked to categorize the world. We mapped the constellations in the night sky. We drew hard borders across ancient continents, and eventually, in the early 20th century, we turned our categorizing minds inward. We sought to organize the internal ocean. We discovered that blood was not perfectly identical. We found that the surfaces of these trillions of red cells were decorated with microscopic structures, tiny molecular sculptures that varied from person to person. We built a system to organize them. We placed humanity into 8 neat, understandable boxes: A positive, O negative, AB positive. We printed these categories on driver's licenses, on military dog tags, and on medical charts. It gave us a sense of profound control, a belief that we had finally decoded the liquid machinery of the human body. We believed the map was complete. But nature does not care for our maps, nor does it abide strictly by the neat, artificial boundaries we draw to comfort ourselves. Somewhere in the vast, continuous shuffling of the human genetic deck, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift occurred. A sequence of microscopic code was skipped. A molecular blueprint was altered in the dark. And from this invisible divergence, a new kind of human biology emerged, completely undocumented and entirely unexpected by the medical institutions of the world. The individuals who possess this anomaly do not know it by simply existing. When they are born, they breathe the same cold air as the rest of us. When they scrape their knee on the pavement as a child, they bleed the exact same shade of dark, heavy crimson. They feel the sting of the winter wind. They experience the exhaustion of a long day, and their hearts beat with the exact same rhythm as the billions of other hearts currently pulsing across the night side of the earth. From the outside, they are entirely indistinguishable from the crowd. They walk through the neon-lit streets of modern cities. They ride on crowded subway cars, and they stand in line at quiet neighborhood grocery stores, entirely unaware that the biological architecture rushing through their veins is rarer than flawless diamonds. Their uniqueness is not measured by an addition to their biology, but by a staggering, near impossible absence. At the deepest, most granular level of their physical being, the intricate molecular forests that normally decorate the surface of the human red blood cell have been entirely swept away. They possess a microscopic landscape that is barren, smooth, and utterly devoid of the complex biological markers that define the rest of the human species. It is a biological minimalism that borders on the impossible. They are the universal ghosts of the medical world, carrying an internal ocean that is completely unburdened by the ancient evolutionary tags that the rest of us inherited. It is a profound and quiet realization to understand that the universe does not always announce its marvels with loud, flashing spectacles or grand, sweeping, cosmic events. Sometimes it buries its most astonishing anomalies deep within the ordinary, hiding the rarest phenomena on Earth inside the silent, rhythmic pulse of a stranger walking past you in the dark. Beneath the surface of the skin, beneath the quiet, steady rise and fall of a resting chest, there exists a universe of unimaginable complexity. If we were to shrink down, descending past the layers of tissue and muscle, slipping through the porous, microscopic walls of a single, pulsing vein, we would find ourselves suspended in a rushing, crimson river. Here, millions of individual entities are swept along in a continuous, breathless current, driven forward by the tireless, rhythmic drumming of the human heart. These are the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, the microscopic vessels that carry the very breath of the world to every distant, hidden corner of the physical form. They are perfectly designed, shaped like tiny, flexible discs, hollowed out in the center to maximize their surface area. In a beautifully selfless act of biological evolution, they lack a nucleus, having discarded their own central command center to make more room for hemoglobin, the heavy, iron-rich protein that binds to oxygen. They tumble through the darkness of our internal rivers, bumping against the smooth walls of the endothelium, squeezing through capillary beds so narrow that they must fold themselves in half just to pass through. It is a silent, perpetual motion machine that sustains our conscious reality, an automated journey taking only seconds to travel from the roaring chambers of the heart to the absolute quiet of the fingertips. But if we were to look closer, to push past the limits of ordinary magnification and examine the very outer boundary of one of these singular red cells, we would see that its surface is not the smooth, featureless dome it appears to be from a distance. The membrane of a human red blood cell is a dense, incredibly intricate forest. It is covered in thousands of microscopic structures, complex towers of proteins, delicate, branching chains of carbohydrates, and lipid molecules extending outward like the overlapping canopy of an alien jungle. In the precise, objective language of biology, these protruding structures are known as antigens. In the functional reality of the human body, however, they serve a much more profound and critical purpose. They are biological barcodes. They are the intricate molecular identification tags that tell the body's highly aggressive, constantly patrolling immune system that this specific cell belongs here. As the white blood cells, the silent, microscopic guardians of our internal world, drift past, they continuously read these complex molecular tags. If the barcode matches the genetic memory of the host, the red cell is allowed to continue its vital journey in peace. If the barcode is read as foreign, if it belongs to an invading organism or an incompatible drop of blood from another human being, the immune system unleashes a devastating, microscopic war to eradicate the intruder, attacking the strange cells until they rupture and dissolve. In the damp, lingering chill of 1937, the full, staggering complexity of this microscopic identification system was completely unknown to human science. In the quiet, sterile laboratories of the Rockefeller Institute in New York, a brilliant and meticulous Austrian biologist named Karl Landsteiner, alongside his dedicated colleague, Alexander Wiener, was peering deep into the hidden architecture of blood. Landsteiner had already revolutionized human medicine decades earlier by discovering the fundamental A, B, and O blood groups, an achievement that had finally allowed doctors to perform early transfusions without the terrifying, random inevitability of fatal clotting. But Landsteiner and Wiener were looking for something deeper, a missing variable in the equation of human survival. They were mixing human red blood cells with the serum of rhesus macaques, watching closely through the lenses of heavy brass microscopes as the invisible forces of molecular biology played out on thin glass slides. What they observed was a sudden, violent clumping of the cells, an aggressive immune response that proved the existence of an entirely new, undiscovered biological marker present on the surface of most human blood cells. Because of the primate serum used to reveal it, they named this newly discovered molecular structure the rhesus factor, or simply the Rh factor. This quiet revelation in a New York laboratory fundamentally altered the trajectory of modern medicine. It was no longer enough to know if someone was simply type A or type O. Suddenly, humanity was divided, once again, categorized by the presence or absence of this specific microscopic tower of protein. If you possessed the Rh factor on the surface of your cells, you were labeled Rh positive. If the protein was absent, you were categorized as Rh negative. It was an elegant binary system that brought a renewed sense of order to the chaotic, high-stakes reality of blood transfusions. It saved millions of lives, allowing surgeons and field medics to match donors and recipients with unprecedented accuracy. For decades, the medical textbooks presented this system as a completed map, a finished biological puzzle that fully explained the nature of human blood. Yet, the closer we look at the natural world, the more its apparent simplicity dissolves into a labyrinth of staggering detail. The concept of a simple, singular Rh factor, a straightforward positive or a clean negative, was a profound underestimation of evolutionary complexity. As the decades passed and the tools of microscopic analysis grew increasingly sophisticated, hematologists realized that the Rh system was not a single, lonely antenna sitting on the surface of the cell. It was an entire, sprawling molecular city. The Rh blood group system is actually composed of an astonishing 61 distinct antigens. It is a massive, interlocking complex of proteins that weave in and out of the red blood cell membrane like a microscopic biological tapestry. Most human beings inherit a complex combination of these 61 proteins, a genetic inheritance passed down through thousands of generations, linking us to the deep evolutionary history of our species. Being Rh negative usually just means lacking one specific antigen within this vast complex, the highly reactive D antigen. The other 60 structures remain, quietly anchoring the cell membrane, maintaining the structural integrity of the erythrocyte, and acting as microscopic channels to transport ammonia and carbon dioxide as the cell navigates the high-pressure environment of the circulatory system. This is where the true, objective reality of the Rh-Null anomaly comes into terrifyingly sharp focus, stripping away the comfort of standard medical textbooks. To possess the golden blood is not merely to be Rh negative. It is a biological event of such extreme rarity that it almost defies the mathematical probability of human genetics. In the blood of an Rh-Null individual, the entire sprawling city of the Rh antigen complex has been utterly erased. All 61 proteins gone. If you were to examine their red blood cells under the most powerful electron microscopes on Earth, you would not find the dense, protective forest of molecular towers that exist in the rest of humanity. You would find a smooth, vulnerable, and entirely barren membrane. It is a microscopic landscape that has been swept completely clean, an evolutionary blank slate drifting silently through the veins of a living, breathing human being. Because these proteins are structural, acting as the microscopic scaffolding of the cell, their complete absence means the red blood cells of an Rh-Null individual are physically altered. Without the Rh complex to anchor the membrane, the cells lose their perfect biconcave shape. They often become stomatocytes, cells that have folded slightly inward, appearing under a microscope to have a mouth-like slit across their center. Their membranes are delicate, fragile, and prone to premature collapse, leading to a chronic, mild state of hemolytic anemia. The body must work constantly, quietly replacing these fragile cells at a slightly faster rate than the rest of humanity. Yet, despite this structural vulnerability, these profoundly rare cells continue their relentless, vital journey. They carry oxygen, they sustain conscious thought, and they quietly defy the biological blueprints that govern the rest of the human race. It is a humbling realization to understand that we are constructed of systems so vast and intricate that they mirror the staggering complexity of the universe itself. Deep within the rushing corridors of our own bodies, far beneath the threshold of human sight, there are sprawling architectural wonders of protein and membrane, microscopic landscapes that are infinitely older and far more complex than any city ever built by human hands. In the lingering, heavy heat of 1961, the city of Perth, perched on the vast, isolated western edge of the Australian continent, was a place defined by its immense distance from the traditional, bustling centers of global scientific research. It is a city bordered by the endless, rhythmic crashing of the Indian Ocean on one side and the ancient, sun-baked, red expanse of the outback on the other. Information in this era did not move at the speed of light. It moved at the steady, deliberate pace of ocean liners and heavy propeller planes, meaning that any profound scientific discovery made in this remote corner of the world was insulated, suspended in its own quiet reality, before it could echo across the globe. Within this geographical isolation, at the King Edward Memorial Hospital, in the quiet suburb of Subiaco, the daily rhythms of medical science proceeded with a slow, steady persistence. The laboratories of the mid-20th century were not the sleek, highly automated, digital sanctuaries we recognize today. They were highly tactile, meticulous spaces filled with the low, continuous hum of heavy steel centrifuges, the sharp, sterile scent of chemical reagents, and the careful, methodical scratching of fountain pens recording patient data into thick, canvas-bound ledgers. The microscopes were heavy, imposing instruments of cold iron and polished glass, requiring the user to sit in absolute, motionless concentration, becoming entirely absorbed in the tiny, illuminated circle of reality beneath the objective lens. It was a world where human vision, peering through these heavy instruments, was the absolute physical frontier of biological understanding. Working within this quiet, analog environment was a meticulous and deeply observant researcher named Dr. G.H. Voss. His days were spent entirely immersed in the microscopic, crimson landscapes we have just explored. He was a cartographer of the internal human ocean, mapping the complex topographies of red blood cells to ensure the safe passage of transfusions for the patients resting in the hospital wards above him. Blood typing, even decades after Landsteiner's initial revelations in New York, was still a highly manual, delicate art. It involved extracting a small volume of deep red fluid, separating the heavy cells from the golden plasma, and methodically introducing drops of specific antisera, translucent liquids containing concentrated antibodies designed to hunt down and bind to very specific biological targets. If a target antigen was present on the surface of the blood cell, the antibodies would lock onto it, causing the cells to clump together in a highly visible, undeniable reaction known as agglutination. It was a microscopic interrogation, a chemical question asked in the dark, yielding a clear, observable answer on a seemingly ordinary day. A routine sample arrived in Dr. Voss's laboratory. It belonged to an indigenous Australian woman, a patient whose ancestors had walked the vast, complex, and deeply ancient landscapes of the continent for tens of thousands of years in continuous, unbroken isolation. Her physiological existence was a quiet testament to the staggering resilience of human genetics, carrying a molecular secret that had perhaps traveled silently through countless generations across the dusty expanses of the land. Completely unbothered by the sudden, recent arrival of modern microscopes and chemical reagents. Her blood, drawn into a simple glass vial, looked entirely indistinguishable from any other sample resting in the cool wooden racks of the laboratory. It held the same heavy, metallic color, the same viscosity, and the same fundamental promise of life. There was no outward indication, no flashing biological warning sign that the microscopic architecture contained within that fragile cylinder was about to profoundly shatter the established boundaries of human knowledge. Dr. Voss began the standard, highly practiced sequence of tests. He introduced the anti-sera, designed to seek out the standard markers of the ABO system, carefully observing the reactions on the cool glass. He then moved deeper into the molecular forest, introducing the specific antibodies designed to hunt for the complex structures of the Rh system. He dropped the serum for the prominent D antigen, the marker that traditionally dictates whether a person is classified as Rh positive or Rh negative. As expected for a negative result, there was no clumping. The red cells drifted freely across the illuminated glass of the microscope slide. But the Rh system, as hematologists were beginning to understand, is a sprawling city of 61 distinct structures. To be thorough, to fully map the surface of the cell and ensure total safety, a researcher must test for the presence of the other fundamental pillars of the complex: the C and C antigens, the E and E markers. These were the standard, expected features, the biological topography that defined the landscape of the human red blood cell. He carefully added the translucent drops of specific antibodies designed to locate these structures, expecting the familiar, comforting sight of agglutination. He expected the cells to react, to reveal the ancient, invisible scaffolding that the scientific consensus declared was absolutely necessary for the structural integrity of the cell. But as he looked through the heavy ocular lenses of his microscope, adjusting the fine focus knob with practiced fingers, the slide remained entirely clear. The cells continued to drift freely, completely unbothered by the chemical interrogators swimming among them. There was no clumping. There was no reaction. There was an absolute, silent absence. He tested the sample again. He checked his reagents, ensuring they had not degraded in the warm Australian climate. The heavy glass vials were double-checked against the handwritten patient records, and the entire chemical interrogation was performed again with painstaking, deliberate slowness. Yet, the result remained identical. Every single antibody designed to map the Rh complex failed to find a target. The entire molecular city was missing. It was not merely a subtle variation or a minor genetic mutation. It was a total, sweeping biological erasure. To fully grasp the magnitude of this quiet, isolated moment in a Perth laboratory, one must understand the absolute, unyielding certainty of the medical dogma of 1961. The sprawling, intricate structure of the Rh antigen complex was not considered an optional feature of human biology. The international scientific community, the authors of the heavy, authoritative textbooks resting on the shelves of prestigious medical schools across the globe, had concluded that this microscopic scaffolding was structurally foundational. It was believed with total conviction that if an embryo were somehow conceived with a genetic mutation that entirely deleted the Rh complex, the resulting red blood cells would be so fundamentally unstable, so structurally compromised, that they would instantly collapse under the immense pressure of the circulatory system. The prevailing, undisputed theory was that such a condition would be absolutely lethal in utero. The textbook stated that a living, breathing human being without a single Rh antigen could not physically exist. It was a biological ghost story, a mathematical impossibility. Yet, sitting in the quiet, sterile air of the laboratory, Dr. Voss was looking at the undeniable, objective proof of the impossible. The blood moving across his microscope slide was not an abstract theory or a failed, degraded experiment. It had been drawn from the veins of a living, breathing woman. She was walking and existing under the vast, bright sky of Western Australia, her heart quietly pumping. Millions of these smooth, barren, impossibly rare cells through her body every single minute. She was the living contradiction to a global scientific consensus. Recognizing the staggering implications of what he was witnessing, Dr. Voss meticulously documented his findings, preserving the fragile samples. They were packed carefully in ice, insulated against the turbulent, high-altitude cold of mid-century aviation, and sent on a long, delicate journey across the ocean to international colleagues, including the eminent Dr. Philip Levine in the United States. When the samples arrived in distant laboratories and were subjected to the exact same rigorous interrogations, the results echoed the quiet revelation of Perth. The international community of hematologists was forced to confront the absolute void on the surface of these cells. They had to collectively rewrite the boundaries of human survival, naming this impossible phenomenon Rh-Null. It is a deeply humbling phenomenon to consider as the hours of the night stretch out and the world around you remains perfectly still. We construct massive institutions of knowledge. We write thousands of pages of absolute certainties, and we believe we have finally mapped the absolute limits of human biology. And yet, all of our grand, sweeping theories and deeply established dogmas can be quietly and completely undone by the silent, microscopic architecture hidden within a single, unexpected drop of blood. Deep within the fractured, towering geography of the European Alps, far removed from the sun-baked expanses and vast horizons where the first murmurs of this biological anomaly were recorded, the landscape dictates a profoundly different rhythm of human existence. For centuries before the advent of modern engineering, we carved long, sweeping tunnels through the hearts of mountains. The high, sweeping valleys of Switzerland were natural fortresses of stone and ice. When the heavy winter snows descended, burying the narrow passes and silencing the forests, the small communities nestled within these deep, glacial crevices were effectively cut off from the rest of the sprawling, chaotic world. They existed in a state of suspended geographical isolation, locked within a physical environment that was as breathtakingly beautiful as it was fiercely impenetrable. In these high-altitude enclaves, generations of families lived, worked, and eventually returned to the cold earth within a radius of only a few square miles. This deep, structural isolation of human populations does more than merely shape the culture or the dialect of a region. It acts as a massive, invisible hand upon the microscopic blueprint of human evolution. When a population remains closed off from the broader, global migration of the species, the genetic pool becomes a quiet, self-contained echo chamber. The immense, sprawling lottery of human DNA, which usually relies on the continuous introduction of vast, distant lineages to maintain its chaotic diversity, begins to fold inward upon itself. It is within these secluded, tightly woven tapestries of human ancestry that the rarest, most mathematically improbable biological variations are given the precise conditions necessary to quietly surface from the depths of our evolutionary history. To understand how an entire molecular city can be completely erased from the surface of a red blood cell, we must descend even further than the flowing rivers of the veins, pushing past the outer membrane of the cell itself, and entering the absolute, lightless sanctuary of the nucleus. Here, tightly wound around microscopic spools of protein, sits the dense, unfathomably complex archive of human DNA. The blueprint for the Rh blood group is not a simple, single instruction. It is a collaborative architectural project requiring the perfect synchronization of different genetic sequences located on entirely separate chromosomes. On the first chromosome, the RhD and RhCe genes hold the specific, detailed instructions for building the complex towers of the Rh antigens. But these towers cannot simply float freely. They require a foundation, an anchor, to secure them to the rushing, turbulent surface of the cell membrane. This critical foundation is provided by a completely different sequence of code, the Rhag gene, located far away on the sixth chromosome. The Rhag gene acts as the master builder, translating its code into a specific glycoprotein that serves as the essential microscopic scaffolding for the entire Rh system. In the vast majority of the 8 billion people currently walking the earth, this genetic collaboration functions with flawless, automated precision. But genetics is a language of continuous replication, and in the copying of billions of letters of biological code across thousands of generations, microscopic misprints are inevitable. In the phenomenon of Rh-Null, this misprint manifests in two distinct, equally staggering ways. The first is the amorphic type, where the genes on the first chromosome are simply missing or completely silent, leaving no instructions to build the towers at all. But the second, and arguably more complex mechanism, is the regulator type. In this scenario, the individual possesses the perfect, flawless blueprints for the Rh antigens on chromosome 1. Their body knows exactly how to build the complex structures. However, a spontaneous mutation has occurred within the Rhag gene on chromosome 6. The master builder has lost the instructions for the foundation. Without this critical glycoprotein scaffolding, the body simply cannot attach the antigens to the cell membrane. The towers are never erected. The genetic potential is there, locked away in the dark, but the surface of the cell remains perfectly, astonishingly smooth. This genetic misprint is what biologists classify as an autosomal recessive trait. It is a silent passenger. A single individual can carry this mutated, altered sequence of code entirely hidden within their DNA, masked by a dominant standard copy of the gene inherited from their other parent. They will have perfectly ordinary blood, completely unaware that they are ferrying a microscopic anomaly through time. They can pass this silent code to their children, and their children can pass it to the next generation, a quiet, invisible inheritance drifting down through centuries of human history. But when a geographical bottleneck, like a secluded, snow-locked valley in the Swiss Alps, restricts the flow of new genetics, the probability of these silent lines crossing increases exponentially. When two individuals, completely unaware that they both carry the exact same, incredibly rare, recessive mutation, have a child, the genetic lottery aligns in a staggering 1 in a million configuration. The child inherits the silent, altered code from both sides. There is no dominant blueprint to mask the anomaly. The biological instructions to build the foundation are completely absent. The child is born with golden blood. The realization of this profound biological rarity rarely arrives with any dramatic fanfare. There are no immediate physical symptoms, no outward signs that a person has just inherited a biological status shared by fewer than 50 people on the planet. Instead, the discovery almost always occurs within the mundane, routine mechanisms of modern healthcare. A young woman might offer her arm for a standard blood donation at a local clinic, or a man might undergo routine preoperative testing before a minor surgical procedure. The vial of dark crimson fluid is drawn, labeled, and sent away to the bright, sterile laboratories of a regional hospital, expected to fall neatly into the familiar categories of the medical world. But then the routine suddenly halts. The local technicians watch in quiet confusion as the heavily standardized chemical reagents fail to elicit any reaction. The blood refuses to conform to the established map. The sample is escalated, packed in insulated containers, and rushed to highly specialized national reference laboratories. And eventually, a phone call is made. The individual is asked to come into the clinic, entirely unprepared for the gravity of the information they are about to receive. Sitting in a quiet, brightly lit office, a hematologist must explain to an otherwise perfectly healthy human being that their fundamental internal biology is a global anomaly. The sociological weight of this diagnosis is immense, settling over the individual with a quiet, undeniable heaviness. They must absorb the deeply unsettling fact that out of the staggering, endless sea of humanity rushing through the cities and continents of the world, they are completely alone. They are given a card to carry in their wallet at all times, a small, fragile piece of paper that loudly declares their profound vulnerability to emergency responders. They are suddenly thrust into an incredibly exclusive, highly monitored biological fraternity, transformed from an ordinary citizen into a living, breathing custodian of a medical resource so rare that it is sought after by international health organizations. They must learn to navigate a world that was simply not designed for their existence. The casual, comforting knowledge that a local hospital holds a reserve of compatible blood in case of an accident is stripped away, replaced by the stark realization that their only biological match might be living a completely different life on a different continent, thousands of miles across an ocean. It is a heavy, invisible burden, carried silently through the crowded streets in the quiet moments of their daily lives. We are all, in our own unseen ways, the culmination of countless historical variables. Every pulse of our hearts is the direct result of a sprawling, unbroken chain of survival and chance, stretching back through the slow, agonizing crawl of evolutionary time. And within the darkest, quietest corners of our genetic archives, we carry the silent, invisible threads of ancestry, quietly binding the isolated, highly specific lives of the present to the sprawling, random, and ancient genetic shifts of the deep past, beyond the quiet, snow-locked valleys and the invisible, silent threads of genetic inheritance. The reality of this profound biological anomaly intersects with the massive, high-stakes machinery of modern global medicine. When we zoom out from the microscopic nucleus of a single cell to the sprawling, hyper-connected infrastructure of international healthcare, the true, staggering weight of the Rh-Null anomaly becomes overwhelmingly apparent. In the bright, sterile, aggressively illuminated corridors of trauma centers and surgical wards across the planet, human blood is a commodity more precious than any manufactured pharmaceutical. It is the raw, unreplicable fuel of human survival. And within this vast, continuous economy of giving and receiving, the medical community relies on a comforting, deeply entrenched illusion: the myth of the universal donor. We are taught from a very young age that individuals with type O-negative blood are the ultimate saviors of the human race. We are told that their blood is a biological master key, capable of being transfused into the veins of any wounded, bleeding human being without triggering a catastrophic immune response. This is, for the vast majority of standard medical emergencies, a highly effective and life-saving approximation of the truth. Because O-negative blood lacks the A and B antigens and lacks the prominent Rhd antigen, it can safely bypass the primary, most aggressive security checkpoints of the average patient's immune system. But this sweeping generalization entirely ignores the sprawling, microscopic city that we have already explored. Type O-negative blood still carries dozens of other complex Rh antigens, the Cs, the Es, and a myriad of other structural proteins that are completely invisible to standard, routine blood typing. For 99% of the global population, these remaining antigens are entirely harmless during a transfusion. But for a microscopic fraction of humanity, individuals who harbor highly specific, incredibly rare genetic variations within their own blood, receiving standard O-negative blood is not a salvation. It is a biological death sentence. If a patient who naturally lacks a specific high-frequency antigen, such as the E antigen, receives a transfusion of normal blood containing that structure, their immune system will not recognize the incoming fluid as a life-saving gift. It will perceive the unfamiliar molecular towers as an invasion of alien organisms. The resulting microscopic war is violent, rapid, and physically devastating. The patient's white blood cells will immediately manufacture perfectly tailored antibodies, releasing them into the bloodstream like a swarm of microscopic, seeking munitions. These antibodies will hunt down the donated red blood cells, locking onto the unfamiliar antigens with absolute, rigid precision. Once attached, they trigger a destructive cascade, tearing open the delicate membranes of the donor cells. This process, known in the cold, objective terminology of medicine as a hemolytic transfusion reaction, causes the red cells to violently rupture, spilling raw, toxic free hemoglobin directly into the blood plasma. As the body desperately tries to filter this sudden, massive influx of cellular debris, the kidneys become overwhelmed. The microscopic filtration tubules clog, and the patient's internal organs begin a rapid, catastrophic cascade toward systemic failure. When a patient with one of these profoundly rare, highly sensitized blood profiles is lying in a hospital bed, slowly bleeding from a surgical complication or a sudden trauma, the standard blood banks of their city, their state, and often their entire country are rendered completely useless. Every single pint of blood resting in the refrigerated glass cabinets of the local hospital is essentially a localized poison to their highly specific immune system. The mathematics of finding a perfectly matched donor in the general population stretch into the tens of millions to one. The surgeons and hematologists are left staring at a problem that traditional medicine simply cannot solve. This is the exact, terrifying precipice where the true value of golden blood is revealed, because the red blood cells of an Rh-Null individual are completely barren, utterly devoid of the entire 61 antigen complex of the Rh system. They represent the ultimate, flawless, blank canvas. There are no molecular towers for the desperate patient's antibodies to lock onto. There is no microscopic architecture to trigger the devastating immune cascade. When Rh-Null blood is slowly dripped into the veins of a patient with an incredibly rare blood type, the aggressive, hypervigilant immune system simply watches the smooth, featureless cells drift quietly by, registering them as nothing more than a harmless, life-sustaining ghost. It is the absolute, unquestionable, universal donor for anyone operating within the complex, rare extremities of the Rh blood group system. Yet, the ability to save a life is fundamentally constrained by the sheer, brutal mathematics of supply. While there are fewer than 50 documented individuals on the planet who possess this anomaly, the number of people who are aware of their status, medically eligible, and actively willing to subject themselves to the continuous, exhausting process of blood donation is staggeringly small. Historically, the entire global safety net for these impossible medical crises has rested on the shoulders of perhaps a half-dozen active donors, 6 ordinary human beings scattered across different continents, living quiet, unremarkable lives, while simultaneously serving as the absolute last line of defense for a planet of 8 billion people. The psychological and emotional burden placed upon this incredibly sparse network of individuals is immense, carrying a weight that is almost impossible for the rest of humanity to fully comprehend. They do not simply donate blood at an annual local drive to receive a complimentary sticker and a quiet sense of civic duty. They are acutely aware that their bone marrow is manufacturing a substance that cannot be synthesized in any laboratory, cannot be bought with any amount of wealth, and is the singular, defining difference between life and death for strangers they will never meet. When a catastrophic medical event occurs involving a patient with a deeply rare blood profile, perhaps a mother hemorrhaging during childbirth in Tokyo, or a child undergoing complex cardiac surgery in Rio de Janeiro, the international databases are urgently queried. In the quiet hours of the night, a phone might ring in a small, unassuming house in Brazil, or a quiet apartment in Switzerland. The person who answers is calmly objectively informed that somewhere on the earth, a human being is slowly fading out of existence, and that they are the only biological mechanism capable of halting the descent. The donor must then quietly disrupt the rhythm of their own life. They leave their jobs, they step away from their families, and they travel to a specialized clinic. They sit in a reclining chair in a silent, brightly lit room, offering the soft, vulnerable crook of their arm to a steel needle. They watch as the dark, heavy crimson fluid leaves their body, filling a sterile plastic bag. It is a deeply intimate, deeply invasive process, performed in absolute anonymity. They surrender a physical piece of their own survival, allowing their internal machinery to be drained and shipped across oceans in highly pressurized, temperature-controlled cargo holds, driven by the absolute, undeniable moral imperative of their own genetic rarity. They are bound to a life of quiet, continuous servitude to the human race, unable to simply ignore the ringing phone without carrying the heavy, agonizing knowledge of the consequences. It is a profound testament to the fragile, invisible architecture of human empathy to realize that in our vast, chaotic, and often divided world, the absolute limits of survival are sometimes completely dependent on the quiet, unpaid sacrifices of unknown strangers, offering pieces of themselves in the dark to keep another heart beating across the globe. When we pull our perspective away from the sprawling, illuminated maps of global flight paths and the high-stakes adrenaline of international trauma centers, the narrative of the universal savior settles into a much quieter, far more melancholic reality. We often romanticize the concept of the absolute biological gift, framing these extraordinarily rare individuals as silent, untouchable heroes of modern medicine, endlessly capable of pouring life into the veins of strangers across the vast expanse of the earth. It is incredibly easy to view them simply as vessels of a miraculous resource, human anomalies who exist solely to balance the chaotic, terrifying equations of emergency hematology. Yet, to view them only through the lens of their utility to others is to completely ignore the profound, undeniable vulnerability that governs every single moment of their own existence, the exact biological mechanism that grants them the ability to save absolutely anyone within the rare echelons of the Rh system is the very same mechanism that places them in perpetual, inescapable danger. The paradox of the golden blood lies in its absolute biological exclusivity. While their internal rivers are a flawless, blank canvas to the rest of the world, the rest of the world is a highly complex, lethally toxic environment to them. If an Rh-Null individual were to lie on a hospital bed, rapidly losing fluid from a sudden injury, the vast, ocean-like reserves of human blood, stored in refrigerated banks across the planet, are completely and utterly useless. If a well-meaning emergency responder, unaware of the profound genetic anomaly resting beneath the patient's skin, were to connect an intravenous line and introduce a single pint of standard, universally accepted type O negative blood, the result would not be a stabilization of the patient's fading vitals. The result would be a rapid, catastrophic, microscopic war. The immune system of an Rh-Null individual has evolved and matured in a completely barren molecular landscape, entirely devoid of the sprawling 61 protein complex of the Rh system. It has never encountered these intricate molecular towers, and it possesses no genetic memory of their existence as a normal, safe component of human biology. Therefore, when standard red blood cells, heavily decorated with these ancient evolutionary markers, suddenly flood into the veins of an Rh-Null patient, their deeply sensitized white blood cells react with sudden, overwhelming violence. The immune system immediately registers the intricate protein scaffolding of the donor cells as a massive, hostile invasion of alien organisms. In a desperate bid for survival, the body unleashes an army of highly specific, aggressively tailored antibodies. These microscopic munitions flood the circulatory system, hunting down the foreign red blood cells, locking on to their unfamiliar antigens, and systematically tearing their delicate membranes apart. The massive volume of destroyed cellular debris clogs the highly sensitive filtration networks of the kidneys, triggering a toxic cascade that rapidly accelerates toward complete systemic failure. The very biological structures that define the common unifying inheritance of the human species are a lethal, devastating poison to the Rh-Null individual. This acute, terrifying vulnerability to the outside world is further compounded by the continuous internal reality of their own structural biology. As we observed in the microscopic depths of their veins, the complete absence of the Rh-associated glycoprotein scaffolding means their red blood cells are fundamentally compromised from the moment they are manufactured in the dark hollows of the bone marrow. They are primarily stomatocytes, slightly deformed, structurally delicate cells that lack the perfect, resilient flexibility required to seamlessly navigate the immense, crushing pressures of the human circulatory system. Because these cells are fragile, they rupture and break down much faster than ordinary erythrocytes. This means that even on a perfectly quiet, ordinary afternoon, sitting in a sunlit room reading a book, an Rh-Null individual is often living with a chronic, mild state of hemolytic anemia. Their biological baseline is already operating on a highly delicate, razor-thin margin of efficiency. Their bone marrow must work continuously, relentlessly, at a slightly elevated pace, just to maintain the absolute minimum threshold of oxygen transport. A quiet, continuous, physical toll exacted by their own genetic rarity. To navigate the modern world with this knowledge is to exist with an invisible, heavy weight resting perpetually on your shoulders. The daily, mundane activities that the vast majority of the 8 billion humans on this planet take entirely for granted carry a profoundly different, underlying current of risk. Driving down a rain-slicked, winding highway at night, hiking through a remote, jagged mountain pass, far from cellular reception, or even electing to undergo a routine, scheduled surgical procedure. All of these common human experiences are shadowed by the undeniable reality of their biological isolation. They must carry specialized, highly visible medical alert cards in their wallets at all times, a fragile, laminated piece of paper that loudly instructs any potential first responder to immediately halt standard emergency protocols. They live with the acute, persistent awareness that if a sudden, violent accident were to occur, the comforting, invisible safety net of modern emergency medicine simply does not exist for them. A severe laceration or a hidden internal hemorrhage immediately becomes a terrifying race against an almost impossible biological clock, entirely dependent on the incredibly unlikely chance that another Rh-Null donor, living thousands of miles away, is awake, available, and ready to bleed for them. Because the active international donor pool is so staggeringly sparse, often limited to a single-digit number of individuals scattered across entirely different time zones and continents. An Rh-Null person is often forced to become their own solitary life insurance policy. If they require a scheduled medical procedure, they cannot simply arrive at the hospital on the morning of the surgery. They must begin a slow, exhausting process, weeks or even months in advance, engaging in what is known as autologous blood donation. They must visit a specialized clinic to have their own rare blood drawn, carefully extracted in small, meticulously measured volumes, so as not to dangerously exacerbate their natural underlying anemia. This dark, precious fluid is then chemically treated, carefully labeled, and placed into cryogenic suspension, waiting in the absolute, icy silence of a specialized facility until the exact moment it is needed. It is a highly localized, deeply solitary, closed loop of survival, a biological feedback loop, where the only entity capable of saving their life is an earlier, preserved version of themselves. It is a profound and heavy meditation to realize that the universe often demands a steep, invisible price for profound rarity. To hold the power to save any life in the world is an extraordinary, almost mythic inheritance, but it is inextricably bound to the quiet, terrifying realization that to be truly biologically unique is to walk through the sprawling crowds of humanity entirely, irreversibly alone, in a quiet, unremarkable sector on the outskirts of Bristol, where the damp, heavy air of the English coast often settles in a persistent, gray stillness over low, brick buildings and vast expanses of wet asphalt. There exists a facility that completely defies its mundane exterior. From the outside, it appears as just another node in the sprawling, continuous landscape of modern commerce, a structure of glass, steel, and concrete entirely silent to the passing observer. Yet, within the highly controlled, sterile environment of this specific building, the International Blood Group Reference Laboratory operates as the absolute central nervous system for the rarest biological architecture on the planet. This is not a hospital in the traditional sense. There are no rushing gurneys or crowded emergency waiting rooms. It is instead a sanctuary of information, a quiet, methodical command center where the most improbable genetic variations of the human species are tracked, analyzed, and carefully mapped against the sprawling, chaotic geography of the globe. It is here that the profound, isolating vulnerability of the individual is suddenly connected to a massive, invisible infrastructure of global cooperation. Deep within the climate-controlled server rooms of this laboratory, resting silently on spinning magnetic drives and solid-state memory banks, lies a digital ledger known as the International Rare Donor Panel. This database is a profound catalog of human anomalies. It does not contain the names of the billions. It contains the highly specific coordinates of the absolute few. It is a continuously updated, meticulously maintained record of those scattered individuals we have previously observed. The quiet, unassuming people walking through the streets of distant continents, carrying a smooth, utterly barren, molecular landscape within their veins. The database links their geographical locations, their highly specific contact information, and the exact, granular details of their microscopic identity. It is a map of biological salvation, holding the fragile mathematical probability of survival for patients who fall entirely outside the boundaries of standard medicine. When a regional health authority in a distant distant hemisphere realizes that their own vast reserves of blood are entirely useless when they find themselves staring into the terrifying void of a patient whose immune system will violently reject anything they offer. This database in Bristol is the singular, final thread of hope they reach for. When the inevitable crisis occurs, perhaps deep within the sprawling, neon-lit density of a megacity in Asia, or within a quiet, isolated surgical ward in South America, a message is transmitted across the global network. It is a highly encrypted, urgent request detailing the exact, impossibly rare biological parameters required to halt a fading pulse. The laboratory in Bristol receives this data, and a calm, deeply deliberate sequence of events is instantly initiated. The database is queried, the algorithm sifting through billions of theoretical human variables until it lands on a single, isolated match. Often, the donor is living an entirely ordinary day, thousands of miles away from the patient, completely unaware that their internal biology is about to be called upon to bridge an ocean. The machinery of global logistics, usually reserved for the high-speed transit of manufactured goods in international commerce, is suddenly hijacked and repurposed for the incredibly delicate transport of raw, living human tissue. The physical preparation of this anomalous fluid for an international journey is a masterpiece of applied thermodynamics and biological preservation. The blood cannot simply be placed in a standard refrigerated box. It must be completely insulated against the vast, unpredictable temperature fluctuations of global transit. The deep crimson fluid, freshly drawn from the arm of the solitary donor, is carefully sealed within heavy, sterile plastic polymers designed to withstand sudden shifts in atmospheric pressure. This fragile bag is then nested within the core of a highly specialized thermal shipper. These containers are modern engineering marvels, constructed with thick, vacuum-insulated panels, lined with precise phase change materials, substances that absorb and release thermal energy to maintain an absolute, unwavering internal climate. Whether the heavy box is sitting on a sun-baked tarmac in the equatorial heat, or resting in the freezing, pressurized cargo hold of a high-altitude aircraft, the internal temperature surrounding the rare cells must remain suspended in a perfect, narrow window, entirely insulated from the chaotic forces of the external world. The biological integrity of the smooth, vulnerable cells depends entirely on this artificial, portable sanctuary. Once the container is sealed, it is handed over to a highly specialized medical courier, an individual whose sole professional purpose is to move biological imperatives across the rigid, often heavily bureaucratized borders of the earth. The journey is a continuous, high-stakes relay. The courier moves swiftly through crowded, echoing airport terminals, carrying the unassuming box past thousands of weary travelers who are entirely oblivious to the microscopic miracle passing right beside them. International borders, which are typically dense, complex barriers of rigid protocols, tariffs, and delays, must suddenly soften and yield. The paperwork accompanying the cooler carries specialized diplomatic and medical clearances, legally categorizing the box not as cargo, but as a critical, time-sensitive extension of human life. Customs officers, who spend their days meticulously scrutinizing the mundane transit of global commerce, recognize the specific, brightly colored medical seals. They step aside, allowing the courier to bypass the slow, agonizing friction of international bureaucracy, creating a seamless, invisible corridor of cooperation that cuts directly through the artificial lines drawn on our maps. Soon, the cooler is resting quietly within the cabin of a commercial airliner, ascending rapidly through the dense layers of the lower atmosphere. At 35,000 feet, cruising at hundreds of miles per hour above the vast, dark expanse of an ocean, the profound juxtaposition of scale becomes almost overwhelming. Inside the small, heavily insulated box, suspended in a perfect, artificially maintained chill, are billions of impossibly rare, smooth red blood cells, completely stripped of their ancient genetic markers. And carrying them is a massive, roaring machine of aluminum and titanium, a testament to modern engineering, slicing through the thin, freezing air of the stratosphere. The solitary donor remains behind, returning to the quiet rhythms of their daily existence, while a physical piece of their own survival hurtles across the curvature of the earth. It is an extraordinary suspension of time and space, a biological tether stretching across thousands of miles of open air, directly linking the solitary existence of one human being to the desperate, fading reality of another. Hours later, the aircraft descends, the heavy tires meeting the concrete of a new continent. The relay continues without a moment of hesitation. The courier moves from the airport to a waiting vehicle, navigating the chaotic, rushing arteries of a foreign city, until finally they walk through the brightly lit, sterile doors of the receiving hospital. The insulated box is opened. The dark, cold fluid is carefully extracted, cross-matched with absolute precision, and finally, slowly allowed to flow into the veins of the waiting patient. The aggressive, highly sensitized immune system of the recipient watches the fluid enter, registering the smooth, featureless cells not as a threat, but as a silent, harmonious continuation of life. The impossible biological equation is solved, not by a single, isolated miracle, but by the massive, deliberate synchronization of hundreds of individuals spanning the globe. It is a profoundly humbling realization to observe how the rigid, artificial boundaries we draw across our continents can completely dissolve in the face of absolute biological necessity, revealing an ancient, silent network of human cooperation that operates continuously and selflessly, binding our scattered, fragile existences together across vast distances and endless miles far beneath the sunlit, rushing surfaces of modern medical campuses, hidden away in the quiet, heavily reinforced sub-basements of specialized national health institutions. There exists a profound battle against the most relentless, unforgiving force in the universe, the forward march of time. Within the standard, brightly lit blood banks of a typical city hospital, the preservation of human life is governed by a strict, undeniable biological clock. When standard blood is drawn from a donor and placed into a specialized refrigerator holding a steady, cool temperature of 4 degrees Celsius, it is merely slowed down, not stopped. The cells continue their microscopic, metabolic processes, slowly consuming their finite stores of glucose, gradually degrading in structural integrity until, after exactly 42 days, they are deemed unviable and must be destroyed. For 99% of the global population, this brief 6-week window of preservation is perfectly adequate, as the high turnover of common medical emergencies ensures the fluid is utilized long before it expires. But for the incredibly sparse, globally scattered network of the Rh-Null anomaly, a 42-day expiration date is functionally useless. catastrophic emergencies requiring golden blood do not adhere to predictable schedules. They may occur twice in a single month, or they may not happen again for another 10 years. To bridge this vast, unpredictable chasm of waiting, the custodians of these impossibly rare cells must abandon standard refrigeration and descend into the extreme, unforgiving physics of cryopreservation. The fundamental goal is no longer to simply slow the cellular metabolism, but to halt it completely, dragging the biological clock down to an absolute, motionless zero. Yet, achieving this state of suspended animation is an incredibly violent, inherently destructive proposition. The human body is composed primarily of water, and water possesses a uniquely devastating property when exposed to sub-zero temperatures. As the thermal energy of the fluid decreases, the water molecules drastically slow their chaotic movement, beginning to align themselves into rigid, heavily organized hexagonal lattices. On a microscopic scale, these expanding ice crystals are the equivalent of millions of jagged crystalline daggers. If a vial of rare human blood were simply placed into a conventional freezing environment, these microscopic shards of ice would instantly form within the intracellular fluid, violently expanding and completely shredding the delicate lipid bilayers of the red blood cells from the inside out, reducing a priceless medical resource to a useless, toxic slurry of ruptured membranes and free hemoglobin. To bypass this thermodynamic certainty, laboratory technicians must engage in a meticulous, highly calculated chemical exchange before the temperature ever begins to drop. The freshly donated Rh-Null blood is slowly, carefully introduced to a heavy, viscous, syrupy compound known as glycerol. Glycerol acts as a profound biological antifreeze as the blood is gently agitated in specialized centrifuges. The glycerol molecules systematically penetrate the outer membranes of the red blood cells, pushing the water molecules out and taking their place within the microscopic cytoplasm. Because glycerol fundamentally disrupts the ability of water molecules to form hydrogen bonds with one another, it completely short-circuits the crystallization process. When the temperature is subsequently lowered, the intracellular fluid does not freeze into sharp, destructive ice. Instead, it vitrifies. It transitions directly into an amorphous, non-crystalline solid state, effectively turning the interior of the cell into a smooth, biological glass. Once the cells are heavily saturated with this protective compound, the true descent begins. The sealed, heavily reinforced polyurethane bags containing the golden blood are placed into heavy aluminum cassettes and lowered into the absolute, lightless depths of cryogenic storage dewars. These massive, double-walled, vacuum-insulated vats are filled with liquid nitrogen, a substance so intensely cold that it boils constantly upon contact with the ambient air, releasing thick, heavy plumes of white vapor across the concrete floors of the facility. As the aluminum cassettes are submerged into this subterranean environment, the temperature of the blood plummets to a staggering negative 196 degrees Celsius. At this profound extreme of thermodynamics, an astonishing physiological silence occurs. The kinetic energy of the molecules drops so low that all enzymatic activity, all protein degradation, and all cellular metabolism instantaneously cease. The cells are no longer aging. They are locked outside the continuous flow of time, perfectly preserved in a state of absolute, suspended animation, capable of remaining perfectly viable in the dark for 10, 20, even 30 years. The true agonizing vulnerability of this entire scientific endeavor, however, is not found in the long, silent decades of storage, but in the sudden, desperate moment of awakening. When a distant hospital issues an emergency mandate for the Rh-Null blood, the aluminum cassette is rapidly pulled from the liquid nitrogen and plunged into a highly controlled, warm water bath. The transition from absolute zero to body temperature must happen in a matter of minutes to prevent any latent ice crystals from forming during the warming phase. But the blood is still heavily saturated with the toxic, highly concentrated glycerol, which must be entirely removed before the fluid can ever enter a human vein. This process, known as deglycerolization, is a terrifyingly delicate manipulation of cellular osmosis. The red blood cells are washed in a continuous, highly precise sequence of saline solutions, each progressively weaker than the last. This descending chemical gradient slowly coaxes the heavy glycerol out of the cells while gently allowing pure water to flow back in. It is during this rapid, high-stakes washing procedure that the inherent, tragic flaw of the Rh-Null anomaly makes itself known. We must recall the microscopic architecture of these specific cells because they completely lack the sprawling 61 protein complex of the Rh system. They are entirely missing the critical Rh-associated glycoprotein scaffolding. They are stomatocytes, slightly deformed, inherently fragile, and structurally compromised from the very moment of their creation. When ordinary red blood cells undergo the intense osmotic pressure shifts of deglycerolization, their membranes flex and stretch, absorbing the sudden influx of water with relative ease. But the smooth, unsupported membranes of the Rh-Null cells are deeply intolerant to this mechanical stress. As the water rushes back into their microscopic hulls to replace the exiting glycerol, the fragile membranes bow dangerously outward, despite the absolute, meticulous care of the highly trained technicians watching the automated centrifuges spin. A heartbreaking mathematical reality cannot be avoided. During the violent awakening from the cryogenic sleep, up to 20% of these impossibly rare cells will succumb to the osmotic pressure, their delicate membranes bursting in the saline wash, their precious cargo lost forever to the centrifuge drain. The technicians must simply accept this loss, carefully harvesting the surviving cells, packaging the remaining diminished volume of golden blood for immediate, high-speed transit to the waiting patient. The cells that survive have endured the absolute extremes of chemistry, pressure, and temperature, proving their staggering resilience before they have even reached the trauma ward. It is a quiet, profound realization to consider the massive, heavily engineered fortresses we build deep beneath the earth, utilizing the absolute extremes of physics and chemistry, all in a desperate, continuous attempt to pause the relentless flow of time, holding a fragile, microscopic spark of human life, suspended in the lightless, absolute cold, until the very moment it is called upon to glow again. Far beyond the heavily reinforced subbasements and the absolute zero of the cryogenic devoirs, a much grander, infinitely slower process has been quietly unfolding across the vast, staggering expanse of deep time. To truly comprehend the profound weight of this biological anomaly, we must look past the immediate, frantic urgencies of modern medicine and trace the long, unbroken lineage of the human internal ocean back to its primordial origins. Long before the first heavy stones were stacked to build the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, and long before the first early hominids ever stood upright to look across the sun-baked savannas of East Africa, the fundamental architecture of the red blood cell was being painstakingly drafted in the dark, mineral-rich depths of the ancient earth. The heavy, metallic taste of our blood, the deep crimson hue that flows from a sudden wound, is a direct, undeniable inheritance from the iron forged in the hearts of dying stars, eventually settling into the crust of our newly formed planet. As the very first complex, multicellular organisms began to drift through the ancient, silent oceans, they faced a profound mechanical problem: how to distribute life-sustaining oxygen from the external environment to the deepest, most insulated cells of their growing physical forms. The evolutionary answer was the creation of a continuous, rushing, liquid, connective tissue, a biological river that has flowed uninterrupted through countless variations of living creatures for hundreds of millions of years. As the slow, agonizing crawl of evolution pushed early species out of the oceans and onto the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of the continents, this internal river grew infinitely more complex. The red blood cell was stripped of its nucleus, flattened into a beautifully efficient biconcave disc, and heavily armored with the intricate molecular forests we now recognize as antigens. Nature does not expend the massive biological energy required to build a sprawling 61 protein complex like the Rh system without a profound, survival-driven purpose. While modern hematologists still debate the exact ancient utility of these microscopic towers, it is widely believed that they originally evolved as a deeply necessary structural scaffolding, allowing the red blood cell to maintain its integrity while navigating the sudden, violent changes in atmospheric pressure and internal temperature that defined the prehistoric world. They may have also served as an ancient, microscopic armor, a complex biological lock designed to prevent the attachment of ancient, long-forgotten pathogens that once swept through the early populations of our ancestors. The Rh complex was a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, a microscopic tool passed down through deep time. Between 60 and 70,000 years ago, a pivotal, incredibly fragile moment occurred in the narrative of our species. Small, highly resilient bands of anatomically modern humans began to walk out of the continent of Africa. They moved in quiet, isolated tribes, navigating by the slow rotation of the stars, crossing vast, shifting deserts, and stepping onto immense, temporary land bridges forged by the freezing of the global oceans during the last great ice ages. As these small populations slowly splintered and drifted apart, wandering into the deep valleys of Europe, the sprawling steppes of Asia, and eventually crossing into the Americas and the isolated expanse of Australia, they carried the entire chaotic sum of the human genetic lottery within their DNA. This immense global dispersion is governed by a quiet, relentless biological force known as genetic drift. When a massive population is suddenly reduced to a small, migrating tribe, the random genetic variations carried by those few individuals are suddenly amplified. If a single hunter walking across the frozen expanse of the Bering Land Bridge carried a silent, recessive mutation, a microscopic misprint in the RHAG gene that governed the construction of the Rh scaffolding, that misprint did not simply disappear. It traveled with them. It was a silent, invisible passenger, entirely masked by dominant, healthy genes. passed down quietly around prehistoric campfires, enduring through thousands of generations of brutal winters and brief, fleeting summers. The genetic blueprint for the golden blood was not a sudden, modern occurrence. It was a deeply ancient potential, a biological time capsule drifting silently through the massive, branching rivers of human ancestry. The individuals today who discover they possess Rh-Null blood are not merely medical anomalies. They are the living, breathing apex of these ancient, highly improbable genetic journeys. The smooth, barren surface of their red blood cells is a direct echo of a microscopic divergence that happened in the unimaginable depths of the past, surviving the long, agonizing walk across the face of the earth to suddenly surface in the sterile, brightly lit clinics of the 21st century. When we look at the immense, isolating burden placed upon these few individuals today, we are witnessing the profound, heavy consequence of a random genetic coin flip that occurred tens of thousands of years before the invention of the microscope. Because this ancient biological inheritance places such a terrifying, solitary weight on the shoulders of so few, and because the fragile logistics of cryogenic suspension and international transit are constantly vulnerable to the chaotic realities of the modern world, the vanguard of medical science is currently looking toward a horizon where humanity might finally sever its absolute dependence on the genetic lottery. Deep within highly funded, cutting-edge research laboratories, a new, unprecedented chapter in the history of human blood is slowly being written. Biogeneticists and chemical engineers are actively engaged in the staggering pursuit of synthetic blood. They are attempting to artificially construct oxygen-carrying molecules, encasing highly purified hemoglobin inside synthetic, lipid-based nanocapsules. The ultimate driving goal of this immense scientific endeavor is to manufacture an artificial erythrocyte that is, by its very design, completely devoid of all surface antigens. They are attempting to replicate the exact barren biological landscape of the Rh-Null anomaly, transforming the rarest, most highly sought-after biological accident on Earth into a mass-produced, universally safe medical resource. To achieve this would be to fundamentally rewrite the ancient rules of human survival. It would mean that a patient lying in a trauma ward, possessing an impossibly rare, highly sensitized immune system, would no longer be forced to wait for a stranger on another continent to bleed for them. It would mean the quiet, unseen network of universal donors could finally be relieved of their heavy, lifelong watch. We are standing on the precipice of an era where the fluid that has dictated the rise and fall of our species for hundreds of thousands of years might finally be mastered and replicated in the cold, objective glass of a laboratory flask. Yet, even as we engineer our way toward this profound, synthetic horizon, the natural, biological reality of our present moment remains deeply tethered to the deep past. Every time the heavy muscle of the heart contracts in the dark, pushing a fresh, crimson tide through the sprawling miles of our internal rivers, it is a quiet, rhythmic reminder of our staggering, unbroken journey across the earth. It is a lingering, profound realization that every human pulse, whether it carries the common, heavily armored cells of the billions or the smooth, impossibly rare cells of the few, is merely an echo of a much older, ancient rhythm. beating steadily against the vast, silent darkness of time. As the grand, sprawling narratives of deep time and the bright, sterile horizons of future medicine slowly recede into the distance, the immense, unfathomable scale of human history gently collapses back down into the quiet, immediate reality of the space around you. The world outside your walls has slowed to a heavy, continuous stillness. The rushing, chaotic, high-frequency noise of the day has long since burned away, leaving only the slow, rhythmic, and deeply comforting cadence of the night. In this suspended, heavily insulated quiet, the frantic urgencies of modern logistics and the complex, microscopic battles of immunology simply cease to matter. There is only the steady, automatic rise and fall of your chest, and the silent, dark river moving tirelessly beneath your skin. Every single breath you take in the dark is a quiet, biological miracle, pulling the invisible, cool atmosphere of the earth deep into the hollows of your lungs, where it meets the waiting, crimson tide. But the heavy, metallic substance that makes this delicate exchange of gases possible, the very core of the red blood cell that grants both the common billions and the impossibly rare Rh-Null individuals their shared, fundamental biological foundation, does not originate from the earth itself. It is a profound, objective truth that the iron coursing through your veins right now, the element that gives human blood its dark, heavy color, is an entirely alien inheritance. It is a physical, indestructible remnant of a cosmic violence so unimaginably vast and deeply ancient that it dwarfs the entirety of human existence to an almost imperceptible fraction of a second. Long before the earth was a cooling sphere of molten rock, long before the continents had formed, or our own sun had even ignited, in the cold dark, the universe was filled with massive, ancient stars burning with unfathomable, terrifying intensity. Deep within the crushing, high-pressure cores of these stellar giants, a continuous, raging battle was fought between the outward, explosive force of nuclear fusion and the immense, inward pulling weight of their own staggering gravity. For millions upon millions of years, these stars survived by forcing lighter elements to fuse into heavier ones. They crushed primitive hydrogen down into helium, then slowly burned that helium into carbon, and carbon into oxygen, meticulously building the elemental, structural building blocks of the entire universe in an environment of absolute, blinding heat. But this grand, cosmic process of creation is bound by a rigid, inescapable, mathematical limit. Eventually, deep in the absolute, lightless center of the star, the fusion process reaches the element of iron. In the mechanics of the universe, iron is the thermodynamic endpoint. It is the absolute limit of stellar alchemy. When a star attempts to fuse iron, the reaction does not release energy. It absorbs it. The moment iron is forged in the core, the delicate million-year balance of the star is permanently, catastrophically shattered. The outward push of fusion suddenly ceases, and the entire, colossal, planetary mass of the star collapses inward at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The core crushes in on itself until it physically cannot compress even a fraction of a millimeter further, and then, in a reaction of unimaginable power, it rebounds. It detonates in a staggering, apocalyptic explosion known as a supernova, an event so violently luminous that it briefly outshines the combined light of entire galaxies. In that singular, brilliant detonation, the heavy, newly forged atoms of iron are blasted outward, scattered violently across the absolute, freezing vacuum of interstellar space. They drift away from the ruin of their creator, plunging into the deep dark. For billions upon billions of years, these microscopic fragments of dead stars float silently through the cosmic void. They gather in vast, sprawling nebulas of dust and gas, suspended in an endless, lightless ocean, completely untouched by warmth or light, drifting in a state of absolute, deep freeze isolation that mirrors the quiet, cryogenic suspension of the rare blood banks we explored earlier, but on a scale that defies human comprehension. Over unimaginable, crawling spans of time, the invisible hand of gravity slowly begins its work again. The drifting clouds of ancient stardust and iron are pulled together, coalescing into a spinning, flattened disk. At the center of this massive rotation, a new yellow star ignites, our sun. And in the outer rings of this swirling disk, the heavier elements clump together, colliding and merging in the silent vacuum to form the rocky planets. The heavy iron from the dead stars sinks deep into the molten core of the young, chaotic Earth, eventually generating the massive, invisible magnetic field that will shield the fragile spark of future life from the lethal, searing radiation of space. But a fraction of that iron remains trapped in the upper crust, scattered quietly through the ancient, cooling rocks and the rich, dark soil. As the oceans form and the very first microscopic organisms begin to multiply in the deep water, this ancient stardust is slowly, methodically integrated into the machinery of life. It is drawn up through the roots of ancient, towering ferns in prehistoric forests. It is consumed by early, wandering animals moving across long-forgotten, shifting continents. It is continuously, relentlessly recycled through millions of years of life, death, and decay. The exact same iron atoms that were forged in the blinding, crushing heart of a dying star and drifted for billions of years through the freezing vacuum of space, eventually found their way into the quiet, agricultural soil of the modern world. They moved into the food that sustained your ancestors, passing silently through generations until ultimately they were woven into the dark, hollow spaces of your own bone marrow. Right now, as you lie resting, feeling the soft, heavy pull of gravity sinking you deeper into your mattress, millions of these ancient, cosmic fragments are rushing continuously through your circulatory system. Every single time the heavy muscle of your heart contracts in the dark, it is pushing the ancient ash of dead stars through the microscopic corridors of your fingertips and the delicate, invisible vessels behind your eyes. You are not merely walking upon the surface of the universe. You are constructed entirely from its most profound and violent mechanics. Whether your internal ocean carries the complex, ancient molecular forests that bind the vast majority of humanity, or whether it happens to be the smooth, barren, and impossibly rare landscape of the golden blood, the fundamental driving cosmic rhythm remains exactly the same. We are all deeply, undeniably tethered to the vast, turning mechanics of the cosmos, carrying a heavy piece of deep time hidden just beneath our skin. The immense, sprawling machinery of the world will continue to turn outside your walls while you sleep. The high-altitude planes will continue their long, dark arcs across the oceans, carrying fragile, insulated medical cargo to distant shores. The deep, heavy centrifuges will continue to spin in the sub-basements of sterile laboratories, and the complex, invisible networks of human empathy will remain constantly vigilant across the globe, protecting the most vulnerable among us. But in this specific, insulated moment, in the quiet safety of this room, none of that requires your attention. The vast, heavy scales of human biology and deep space can simply be allowed to exist without you. As the night deepens around you, I want you to let the images of sprawling molecular cities, isolated mountain valleys, and distant, ancient migrations slowly begin to fade into the dark. You do not need to hold on to any of the history or the science we have explored. You don't need to remember the intricacies of the Rh system or the silent, heavy burdens of the universal donors. Let it all drift away, leaving only the steady, rhythmic pulse of your own quiet existence. If you're still awake and you've enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, you can gently tap the like button or subscribe. But for now, you don't need to do anything at all. Rest well.